Kia ora, e te whānau ai hukaraiti, ko Andrew Doubleday aho. Today we're looking at the text for Sunday the 16th of February. It's Luke chapter 6 verses 17 through to 26. Now we did have a bit of a look at this last week. It almost coincidental, if there is such a thing. Last week my message was titled Sermon on the Boat, in contrast to Sermon on the Mount and Sermon on the Plain. And I looked at the context surrounding Jesus preaching from the fishing boat at Capernaum. I referenced the text that we're looking at today. So I'm going to encourage you to read it, Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through to 26, in your translation of choice. I generally, for these purposes, use the New Revised Standard Version. And then I'm inviting you to pause the video, and then we'll come back to it. Right. Now, assuming you've read the text, for those that didn't look at last week's message or have long forgotten what I said, what I suggested was that Jesus' interpretation, Jesus' take, was very countercultural. It was contrary to what the people believed. It was a real push against the first century version of prosperity teaching. This idea that only good people prospered, and that if terrible things happened, it was a sign that you were being punished by God. So born blind, for example, was a classic example that something terrible had happened, that you or your parents had done something terrible, and God was making that known to everybody. The story that kind of illustrates it otherwise is the story of the rich young ruler, which I think you find in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. And in this, at the end, Jesus says how difficult it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. And his disciples are aghast. They say, what? If the rich can't get in, how can anybody else? So for them, there was this deep sense that prosperity and success and power and authority were all signs of some measure of personal holiness and the approval of God. Jesus, I want to suggest, strongly pushes back against this and says this is just not the case. And so today, rather than continuing down that path and looking at the issue as of poverty and failure, not as a sign of God's judgment, but as an opportunity to consider something else, I'm going to start by reading today from Eugene Peterson's The Message, because he has a really interesting and a useful take which leads us down a different but more life-giving path. I'm not going to read the whole text. I'm going to pick it up in terms of with what Jesus says. Jesus speaks. You're blessed when you've lost it all. God's kingdom is there for the finding. You're blessed when you're ravenously hungry. Then you're ready for the messianic meal. You're blessed when the tears flow freely. Joy comes in the morning. Count yourself blessed every time someone cuts you down or throws you out. Every time someone smears or blackens your name to discredit me. What it means is that the truth is too close for comfort, and that person is uncomfortable. You can be glad when that happens. Skip like a lamb if you like. For even though they don't like it, I do, and all heaven applauds. And know that you're in good company. My preachers and witnesses have always been treated like this. Now, listen to the next bit. But it's trouble ahead if you think that you've made it. What you have is all you'll ever get. And it's trouble ahead if you're satisfied with yourself. Yourself will not satisfy you for long. And it's trouble ahead if you think life's all fun and games. There's suffering to be met, and you're going to meet it. There's trouble ahead when you live only for the approval of others, saying what flatters them, doing what indulges them. Popularity contests are not truth contests. Look how many scoundrel preachers were approved by your ancestors. Your task is to be true, not popular. Wow. Wow. So here we have Jesus turning the whole thing on its head. And I want to suggest to you today that what Jesus is inviting us into is a kind of spiritual yearning. One of the reasons that fasting works, not just to help us to lose weight, but it works at another level, because there's a sense as we physically feel hungry, it ignites something within the spirit. It gives us more of an openness to the purposes and the presence and the work of God in us. Now, if you've never tried it, I commend it to you. And so there's a sense that when we have everything, we think we've got it made, we then put ourselves potentially in the position of those who are rich, who are powerful, and have actually told themselves that they're there because they deserve it. Now, you've just got to look around the planet. It's what's happening in various parts of it, and see how the uber rich behave, to recognize they all have pretty well all, most of them have a profound sense of entitlement and believe that they deserve it. Just got to look at what's happening in the States at the moment. Actually, you don't have to go too far in this country to see the same thing. I've worked hard for what I've got. I deserve to be fantastically wealthy. And for some, it'll be a sign that God has said yes to me, that God is approving of me, because I'm particularly good. Now, the problem is that once we get into that mode, there's very little opportunity for self-reflection. There's very little opportunity for being able to look at the self as being less than totally amazing. And Jesus is inviting us to develop a kind of spiritual hunger, a yearning for God that only God can fill the holes with. And that's what we see here. So there's one wonderful little story much later in Luke where Jesus tells a story. He says 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like others, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. And there, I've even mentioned fasting. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He could not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you, says Jesus, that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he, the one who humbles themselves, will be exalted. Have you got within you that place of recognizing that you haven't got it all sorted, that you haven't arrived, that there's still a profound and deep need of grace within you? That's what Jesus responds to. That's what the Spirit of God responds to. Responds to those who are aware of their spiritual hunger, who are aware of their neediness, who are aware of their own weakness and failures, and are seeking grace for fresh beginnings and new starts and wanting to walk the path with Jesus. And as we start to look, we see that it's kind of right through the teachings of Jesus. Ask, he says, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. But the E's are not just one-offs there. Have a sense of ask and keep on asking. Seek and keep on seeking. Knock and keep on knocking. It'll come your way. Just trust. It'll come your way. Just trust. And so, as we're just reflecting on this text for today, it seems to me that Jesus is inviting us into this place of spiritual poverty. Not that we are poor, but that we become aware of the deep well of neediness that each of us carries. That we haven't plastered over it with success or prosperity, or where we fill our lives with all kinds of distractions to actually blind us to the reality of our ongoing, deep and present need. And that it's when Jesus meets us in those places by his Spirit that we discover a peace and a serenity and a quiet joy that only he can give us. God bless you.